This is a response to the Rebel Wisdom interview with Daniel, one word, Schmachtenberger. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. The title of the video is The War on Sensemaking. So, I have listened to literally 96% of this video, no, more than that actually, but so I should probably see where it's going right at the end, but so this might actually be slightly inappropriate, although I don't think so based on some of the things that I've just heard. I mean, most of this video is very insightful and very fundamental sort of thinking that I think is wonderful. That it's being uh, broadcast and given a platform, and Daniel is obviously a very clever person, but in what he suggests in terms of he goes right into talking about intuiting what a post-game theory sort of society would sort of look like. And I think he really has to dial back all of, because I can see in some of his thinking that he thinks that there's a uniform solution to these things, and there's a kind of we just need to sort of project ourselves into that kind of existence or something like that. Okay, he didn't say that explicitly, but in how he's presenting these ideas, it's slightly ironic to some of the content that he's just gone over, that the idea is that we should just sort of uh, let's just imagine how great it is to be there or something like that. But, okay, I don't want to be too cruel on this point, because at some point you do have to make it a desirable end and then work out how you're going to achieve that. I would say it does sound a bit utopian to kind of talk about this. I think you need to actually be much more humble about the utility of a better culture or something like that, in terms of it existing within the kind of, let's say, the ravenous and hostile landscape. The idea that everyone's just going to convert to this religion of this way of thinking simultaneously. Um, that's a bad model. You need to have something that works on a small scale, something that can essentially develop into what you might hope for, but that you're not invested in achieving the kind of the total world domination, that you're quite satisfied with it on that scale, and that it's capable of being in a hostile environment. Um, and that, I think, really has to be seen as worthy in itself. If it's not, then essentially you've just created another sort of gimmick of people investing into a kind of strange gimmick, and sort of exteriorizing their locus of control, or however Daniel describes some things that sort of resonate with that kind of sentiment. And that's why I find it slightly ironic that he has this idea that he envisages changing the economy and changing governments and changing these things. uh, this is wholly irresponsible. It's unpractical. um, it's even dangerous. It is fundamentally utopian. All of the substance that he says is very viable and relevant to life. It's very important for intellectual life, and it does have a way of having as a perhaps even an ethical kind of consideration that allows one to orientate oneself towards authenticity, so as to have a life that makes sense, even. but having this model where, we can only, things are only going to get better if we can sort of have a certain kind of revolution uh, towards this thing. It doesn't, even the things that he is talking about, the substance that he is talking about, it doesn't it doesn't work with things like a democratic government, um, because you don't have agreements in democracies. You don't have 100% buy-in, and this. If you'll just forgive me for not intellectually sort of steel manning this point, but this sense making thing, although it is utterly reasonable and justifiable, it's tantamount to a religious perspective on treating epistemology in a very careful way. You could say it displaces false religion or something like that. Um, but it's a very well developed moral sort of perspective or worldview or something like that, that's capable of adapting itself and such. But you can't expect people, you can't compel people to engage in this way. You might be able to share a culture with people who disagree with you, and perhaps grow a greater sort of consensus in some general consensus. But you're never going to, one should never even expect 100% buy-in. So I mean, let me just give you my alternative vision as to how you would actually actualize this kind of ethics. Um, is you would do it within the market economy. In fact, it would be easiest to be able to exercise it and pursue it within a market economy with private property and within a liberal democratic somewhat framework, um, in the sense that you would then have potentially the freedom within a liberal Western style democracy to do your own thing, to negotiate between members of an organization that consensually decide to set up an organization and to fulfill these, to perhaps fulfill some of the functions that otherwise the state might perform, not to revolt against the state, but to create a pseudo sub-state within, lawfully within the liberal democratic paradigm, which is that you essentially are creating, in the same way that people own a gym membership and that gives them the right to use the facilities of the gym, and they expect the gym to be regulated and run in certain ways, they can do the same for this pseudo sub-state, and they will have the ability to do a lot more things. Perhaps what would in a strictly democratic sense, um, within a republic would be seen as radical, because they would actually have the wherewithal, the right to do so, because they had agreed to certain processes or agreed to a certain culture that permitted being able to do things with the right amount of requirements being met or whatever. So it would all be done by consent. Whereas if you try to do anything in a state, you're fucked, because already, how do you put up with the people that don't agree with your religious perspective? I mean, it's insufferable. I mean, you have to re-educate them. You have to find a way to immunize whatever project you have that depends on this uniform, um, superior standard. It really is not fit for the competitive model, and you can't just wish that away by saying, oh well, we'll get all these nice things after we get post game theory. Well, no, that's not even worth thinking about if you can't even work out the vehicle for actually navigating that process that goes through the existence of the current game theory. So that's just what I mean by utopian. And I understand that that's not necessarily the topic that he wanted to talk about, and so he's free to kind of discuss these things as he may do so. And perhaps he did want to sort of give this visionary kind of project, but I do take issue with it for the reasons that I have just explicated. I probably just used the wrong word. I should look up that word. What was the other thing that I wanted to say about this? Was there anything else? Yeah, and I'll just say as well that if such people do create such alternative economic models within their own essentially collectivized private property, essentially property that they have bought from the market, so that they have bought their own freedom essentially from the market, and within that they have enough accumulated capital in terms of I can't remember. I used to have a very short way of describing this, but basically, um, if you create enough of your own stuff and you're able to essentially invest that into higher productivity, then you can keep on reducing your inputs by just having an expanded base of capital investment. And so as soon as you've got a little bit of a surplus, you can kind of just keep on concentrating capital investment, and therefore you will increase the wealth if you've got enough of a kind of spread in terms of you don't necessarily have to be able to produce everything that you depend on. You just have to produce enough that you can also then perhaps trade with the market for what it actually generally sells things for that are cheap to buy, and so you try focus on doing the things that are more expensive, and perhaps also things that you can sell to the market if you're not fully independent of it. In fact, if this model becomes so successful and starts to displace most of the other structures, because people do want to replicate the model and develop it themselves, and perhaps that's actually how you generate good faith, that's how you generate stability in the world, because as soon as you've got functional independence, then you've actually got someone who is extricated from the game theory, as it were. And so then they can be seen as honest brokers, as good actors, essentially. They're not in the matrix, as it were. In fact, they might even do quite a lot of things to help support the longevity and subsistence of the market, because you wouldn't want the market to suddenly collapse and then you've got paupers on your doorstep begging for something, and these people are also perhaps not didn't want to join the model to begin with. So then you've got a real sort of horrible catch-22. It's sort of like, but trying to mitigate that threat is far better than not even having the ability to even create something. Not even having the political access, because you don't live in a Western-style liberal democratic society, to even be able to try such a thing. Um, because what I described, the biggest threat to it would actually be socialism. If you actually, because I mean, in some level, I would say that what I described would actually be the actual answer to the Marxist communism or something like that. Um, I mean, I guess the true Marxists would say they'll never let you get away with it. They'll bring you down. They will plant false evidence. They will see you as an existential threat and they'll take you out. Well, you know, I think that kind of paranoia, I am not to say that there perhaps won't be some interference, but if you actually have a decent system, I think you should be able to protect yourself, especially with the media that exists today. If one is careful enough, uh, one can perhaps be resilient, and perhaps even through that resilience prove a kind of resolve that might help. I mean, it's going to be hard enough just to make the model work, because trying to actually do things in house and burden the response, it's easy to be a revolutionary. Somebody else is always the cause of your problems, and you just need to steal power essentially and expropriate whatever thing that you complain that you lack for. But when you actually have to build these capacities in house, and you actually have to be responsible for sustaining things and maintaining them and growing them and developing them and having the requisite skills to do all these things, then you actually see what the challenge actually entails, and it's a very different sort of animal than the kind of revolutionary kind of uh, abject, kind of sympathy, creating these strange conventions of social sympathy that have this resonance with this cosmic morality that you're sort of trying to invoke representations of that kind of is almost like a kind of paganism, some kind of very strange drama, uh, where you're trying to force everyone into this kind of objectified representation of this kind of cosmic. It's almost like you can kind of take the perspective of the Greek gods in their multitude of intrigues and tragedies and such, and superimpose those themes onto these dealings of men who have this kind of hubristic, kind of, I'm representing these cosmic forces, and I'm projecting the objectification of this cosmic morality onto the people around me, and engaging therefore in the most abject form of slave morality that eventually can't even sustain its own appearance of truth, um, which becomes quite an embarrassing, oversimplified kind of game of rhetoric. I've often thought that one of the things that would be useful to sell in such an alternative society would be education, because having an independent locus of authority that's sort of distinct from the state would perhaps be able to have a level and degree of sophistication in its education system, that it would have such a starkly different standard and would be able to develop and flourish in such a way that it would be perhaps on par with the esteemed even tertiary education institutions and such. Um, well, I mean, it's that might not be so, because it might be such a kind of, it's not just something that you could probably just get into. You would have to get into at the bottom, because a very sophisticated education system would probably be of a very different quality, especially in the early years. People forgot, but there were praetors in the Roman Republic that were like 12 years old. You had uh, in the noble households, the children were very politically active and intellectually active, very, very young, even prepubescent, or the start of their puberty. They were in very high office after having had lots of experience and being able to absorb um, instruction from their Greek philosopher instructors and such. Um, Anyway, this is tangential, but yeah, it's interesting that, I mean, yeah, I don't notice that what Daniel said is, these things, they have never really existed. And I think that the only thing that could actually resemble it existing, at least the form of it, would be actually what was originally intended by the idea of the church. Uh, Obviously, not in the sense in which most Christian denominations comport themselves. Um, in the sense that the church is the ground of communion. But anyway, I'll just stop talking. Which essentially is a cultural movement that is spreading the values and sharing in those values and actualizing them and keeping them alive and preserving them in some form. Um, so I guess that would be my suggestion to Daniel. Perhaps start a church in some form. It doesn't have to necessarily, perhaps a secular kind of church. Um, and my second thing would be to not dream about things as if we're all going to get there. I think there's a lack of humility in sort of, there's this implicit, strange belief that, like, this idea is so good, everyone is going to adopt it at some point. I think that is slightly conceited, and I don't mean this as a character attack on Daniel, but I think we need to be more humble about, uh, even if we are very confident that something is intellectually superior and better and in every way. um, I don't think one should assume that uh, individual choice is not, or and culture itself is just not going to be impervious on some level, and to only start the kind of the intellectual cerebration at the point at which we're already post game theory, I mean, that is really to concede the whole thing in a very strange sort of way. And just, and perhaps this is because of uh, my doctrinal understanding of Christianity, which I don't want to sort of I I don't see it as authoritative. I because I understand it myself, and I'm not drawing from the scriptures, but um, just the general idea uh, is that what is at the heart of people is free will, and that means that people are going to have, or at least some people are going to have, quite a rebellious sort of nature, and we do actually need to find a way to endure that. It's not something that should be eradicated. It's something that does actually need to be endured, and having something that's capable of enduring it is, I think, part of whatever the solution is. It is actually is part of a certain kind of humility. And merely restricting ourselves, or at least imagining something in which we've got this 100% buy-in. I mean, like any ideologue of any ethical system gives themselves way too much leeway in granting themselves, oh, yes, after my ideology has won the world, then we get XYZ. It's like, it's just too easy. Uh, and that mind frame, I think, is quite constrictive and arbitrarily constrictive. And it is also quite invested and attached into things that are beyond the control of any agency and when I say agency, I mean free will. um, these are things that cannot be determined for other people, and merely wishing it to be so, because you think you've got the goods, even if you do have the goods. uh, yeah, I mean, I just see that as slightly it's a I don't want to focus too much on this, because, as again, like, this, you could explain this away and say, well, Daniel is just sort of trying to elaborate a kind of a contemplative structure, and so he's talking about, you know an exemplar kind of model of the good things that are built into this way of thinking, by talking about what society would look like post game theory. Um, So if that is the case, I slightly apologize, but I do think that this is a nuanced subject, and just merely kind of talking about it in that way is becomes, well, it incenses me to the extent that which I'm happy to call it out as, I mean, perhaps an unconscious form of sophistry. I don't want to be too harsh. I'm using very harsh words. Is there anything else I can say? Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I just, almost on a philosophical and slightly, and that's somewhat indirectly related to epistemic, sort of issues. I think it's important to reconcile the idea that, everyone wants to be part of something that is somewhat immortal or permanent or complete, and they don't want to get involved in a kind of a halfway measure or something like that, like something that is not eternal in some material form, that is, they can't sort of depend on it and lean on it and count on it. And I actually think that there is something more uh, eternally resilient in an immaterial sense, in a spiritual sense, perhaps even, about the halfway measure, because it is halfway, because it's not guaranteed in any material form that it takes. It is therefore a continued life, a continued living, of a continued choice, um, to continue to choose its own, or continue to choose to sustain its own contemplative framework, or ethic. And so it must continue to choose that, as opposed to uh, the other options that are perhaps even surrounding it. probably could have made that point a bit more eloquently, but yeah, I'll just leave it up to your imagination, I guess. Stop the recording.